How many times have you seen a face on a poster like this and felt a momentary pang of sadness before moving on with your day? We tell ourselves these stories are distant, something that happens to other people in other towns. But what if the one clue that could solve it all isn't buried in a cold case file, but in a memory? A memory tucked away for decades, dismissed as insignificant, waiting for the right moment, the right conversation, to be unearthed. This is the story of a mother's undying hope, a town haunted by a ghost, and a casual chat between two moms at a soccer game that would unravel a mystery 28 years in the making. It's a story that proves that sometimes the most extraordinary answers are found in the most ordinary of places. Before we dive into this incredible journey of fate and memory, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and click the notification bell. You won't want to miss a single chapter of this unbelievable true story. Now, let us take you back to a perfect autumn day, a day that would become a town's darkest memory, and the beginning of a mother's 28-year nightmare. The town of Harmony Creek, Ohio, was, by all accounts, a prisoner of its own past. To a visitor in the autumn of 2025, it presented a picture of idyllic Midwestern charm. Historic brick buildings lined Main Street, a peaceful river ambled along the town's edge, and the scent of wood smoke and decaying leaves hung sweetly in the air. But for those who had lived there for more than a couple of decades, the town's name was a cruel irony. There had been no true harmony in Harmony Creek since September 27, 1997. That was the day 6-year-old Leo Vance vanished from the annual fall festival. No one felt that dissonance more acutely than Sarah Vance. At 58, Sarah was a woman sculpted by grief. It had carved fine lines around her eyes, which still held a startling, youthful blue, and it had infused her movements with a permanent, weary grace. She still lived in the same two-story colonial on Elm Street, the one with the porch swing where Leo had learned to tie his shoes. She had never been able to bring herself to leave, believing on some primal, irrational level that if she did, Leo would have no way of finding his way home. Her life had become a meticulously curated museum of loss. Leo's room was untouched, his Star Wars figure still poised for a battle on his windowsill, a thin layer of dust the only testament to the passage of 10,220 days. Her husband, Tom, had not been able to live in the museum. The strain had been a slow-acting poison on their marriage. He'd wanted to move, to start over, to try for another child. To Sarah, these suggestions felt like acts of profound betrayal, like packing Leo away in a box and storing him in an attic. They divorced 8 years after the disappearance, the chasm of their shared grief too wide to bridge. Tom moved to Arizona, where he remarried and had 2 daughters. He called every year on Leo's birthday and on the anniversary of his disappearance, his voice thick with a guilt and sorrow that time had done little to diminish. Sarah's life now revolved around a quiet, unyielding routine. She worked part-time at the town library, the silence of the stacks a welcome reprieve from the noise in her own head. Her true work, however, was the Leo Vance Foundation for Missing Children, an organization she ran from her dining room. It was a small, local charity that printed flyers, organized search parties for other missing children in the state, and maintained a website that, at its heart, was a digital monument to her son. The home page was dominated by 2 images of Leo side by side. One was the last school photo taken of him, a gap-toothed, freckle-faced boy with an unruly mop of sandy brown hair. The other was an age progression photo, a haunting digital composite of what Leo might look like at 34. He was a ghost and a stranger all at once. The town itself had never healed. Every September, a quiet, unofficial memorial would take place. Flowers and teddy bears would appear at the base of the old oak tree in the center of the park, the very spot where the fall festival's main stage had been. The case was Harmony Creek's defining tragedy, its own dark folklore. Newcomers were told the story in hushed tones. Children were warned with an intensity that bordered on panic not to talk to strangers. The police file, now several thick, dusty binders, had long been moved to the cold case archives in the county seat. The original lead detective, a man named Frank Miller, had retired a decade ago, haunted by the case he always called the one that got away. Into this town of long shadows and quiet grief moved the Riley family in the summer of 2025. Jessica Riley was a graphic designer who could work remotely, and her husband, Mark, had just been hired as the new head of engineering at a manufacturing plant a few towns over. They bought a modern house in a new development on the edge of town, a place that felt immune to the weight of local history. They had a 7-year-old son, Noah, a boisterous, energetic boy with the same sandy brown hair as the child on the posters Jessica soon began to notice around town. Jessica, at 44, was a chronic worrier, a mother whose love manifested as a low-grade, constant anxiety. Seeing the faded posters of Leo Vance, a boy so close in age to her own son, sent a chill down her spine. She learned the story from her next-door neighbor, a woman who had been a teenager when Leo disappeared. The tale was told with a somber reverence that made Jessica's protective instincts flare. She held Noah a little tighter that night, her mind replaying the horror of a mother turning her back for just a moment. The two women, Sarah and Jessica, moved in separate orbits within the small town, their lives unknowingly on a collision course. They were both mothers of sons, but their experiences were worlds apart. Sarah's motherhood was a phantom limb, an ache for a presence that was no longer there. Jessica's was a tangible, exhausting, and beautiful reality of packed lunches, scraped knees, and bedtime stories. Their first meeting was as mundane as it was fated. It was a crisp Saturday in October, and the park was bustling with families enjoying the autumn sunshine. Jessica was pushing Noah on the swings, her mind wandering, when she noticed a woman sitting alone on a nearby bench. The woman was staring at the old oak tree, where a small, fresh bouquet of daisies had been placed. It was Sarah Vance. Jessica recognized her from the photos on the Foundation's website. A wave of sympathy washed over Jessica. She had read about Sarah, the grieving mother, the town's tragic heroine. Seeing her in person, looking so solitary and sad, was deeply moving. On an impulse, she spoke. "It's a beautiful day, isn't it?" Jessica said, her voice soft. Sarah was startled from her reverie. She turned and saw a kind-faced woman with a friendly smile. "Yes, it is," Sarah replied, her voice a little rusty from disuse. "I'm Jessica Riley. We just moved here in August. This is my son, Noah." She gestured to the boy on the swing, who gave a cheerful, oblivious wave. "Sarah Vance," Sarah said, though she knew the introduction was unnecessary. "It's nice to meet you." They fell into the easy, familiar rhythm of mom talk. They spoke of schools, of the best place to buy groceries, of how quickly the weather was turning. For a few minutes, Sarah felt a flicker of normalcy, a feeling so alien it was almost jarring. She was not the grieving mother. She was just a woman in a park. She found herself studying Jessica, this vibrant, happy woman whose life was so blessedly ordinary. There was no envy, only a profound, hollow ache for what she had lost. As Noah's pleas to go to the slide became more insistent, Jessica prepared to leave. "It was really nice talking to you, Sarah," she said sincerely. "You too, Jessica," Sarah replied, a faint, genuine smile touching her lips. As Jessica walked away, holding her son's hand, she glanced back at Sarah, who had already turned her gaze back to the oak tree, her brief moment of connection over, the veil of her grief once again drawn. Jessica felt a deep, inexplicable pull towards the woman. She couldn't have known it then, but their small, innocuous conversation was the first tremor of an earthquake that would soon shatter 28 years of silence. The threads of two lives, one defined by a question and the other unknowingly holding the answer, had finally, fatefully, intertwined. To understand the silence that fell over Harmony Creek for 28 years, one had to understand the noise and chaos of September 27, 1997. It was a day of sensory overload, a perfect tapestry of small-town bliss that, by nightfall, would be ripped to shreds. The Harmony Creek Fall Festival was the town's crowning annual event. It was a day when farmers became carnies. The high school football field transformed into a midway, and the entire community congregated in a joyous, chaotic celebration of the harvest. For 6-year-old Leo Vance, it was the best day of the year, even better than Christmas. The day began with a sugar-fueled excitement that was palpable. Leo, dressed in his favorite red t-shirt with a rocket ship on it and a pair of brand-new sneakers, vibrated with anticipation. Sarah, then a vibrant 30-year-old with a laugh that came easily, packed a bag with sunscreen and juice boxes while Tom, a sturdy, good-natured contractor, quizzed Leo on what he wanted to do first. The Ferris wheel, Leo had shouted, and the caramel apples, and the pony rides. The festival was a whirlwind. The air was thick with the smells of popcorn, hay, and grilled hot dogs. The sounds were a symphony of cheerful chaos. The tinny music of the carousel, the delighted screams from the tilt-a-whirl, the barker's call from the ring toss game. The Vances met friends, their children running in a pack from one attraction to the next. Sarah and Tom exchanged knowing, happy smiles over their kids' heads, feeling the deep, uncomplicated contentment of a family embedded in a community, secure in their small, perfect world. Leo was a whirlwind of motion, a small, energetic blur of a boy. He was both independent and a mama's boy. He'd run ahead to look at something, but always, he would stop and look back, his blue eyes searching for his mother's, needing that reassuring nod before darting off again. It was their silent tether. He had a small, unique birthmark on the back of his right hand, a tiny, perfectly formed crescent moon, which Sarah would often trace with her finger as he fell asleep. That day, his hand was often clasped in hers, sticky with cotton candy. The afternoon began to wane, the sun slanting low across the field, casting long shadows. They had done it all: the rides, the games, the petting zoo. Leo had won a small, bright red wooden airplane at the beanbag toss, a prize he clutched in his hand as if it were the most precious treasure on earth. He refused to let it go. The last stop was for lemonade. The stand was near the main stage, where a local country band was playing a loud, foot-stomping tune. The area was crowded, a throng of people clapping and talking. Tom had taken a friend's younger child to the bathroom, leaving Sarah and Leo by the edge of the crowd. "I'm so thirsty, Mommy," Leo said, looking up at her. "I know, sweetie. The line is just a little long," Sarah said, ruffling his hair. The line moved slowly. Leo, growing restless, began to make his little red airplane fly, weaving it through the forest of adult legs around them, always staying within arm's reach. The band finished their song to a roar of applause. "Just 2 more people ahead of us, honey," Sarah said, turning to him. He was there, making the plane dive bomb her sneaker. He giggled. She turned back to the counter, pulling her wallet from her purse. It was a moment that could not have lasted more than 30 seconds. She ordered 2 lemonades, paid the man, and turned back around, a cup in each hand. "Here you go, Lou." The words died in her throat. He was gone. The air seemed to rush from her lungs. A cold, sharp panic, unlike anything she had ever known, seized her. "Leo?" she called out, her voice tight. She scanned the immediate area, her heart beginning to hammer against her ribs. He was probably just hiding. It was a game. A stupid, not funny game. "Leo, this isn't funny. Come out now." Her voice was louder now, sharp with a rising terror. People began to turn and look. She pushed through the crowd, her eyes darting everywhere, searching for a red t-shirt, for a flash of sandy hair. She circled the lemonade stand, then the entire area around the stage. Nothing. The cheerful music, the laughter. It all became a mocking, surreal soundtrack to her spiraling nightmare. She found Tom as he was coming back. The look on her face told him everything. "I can't find him," she gasped, the words barely audible. "Tom, I can't find Leo." What followed was a blur of escalating panic. They retraced their steps, their calls for their son growing more frantic. Friends joined the search. The vague, unconcerned looks from strangers turned to ones of pity and alarm. Within 15 minutes, the festival security was alerted. Within 30, the band on stage had stopped playing, and a grim-faced announcer asked everyone to please look for a 6-year-old boy in a red rocket ship shirt. The festival died. The music stopped, the rides ground to a halt, and the cheerful cacophony was replaced by an eerie, focused silence, punctuated by hundreds of voices calling the same name, Leo. Leo. Detective Frank Miller was one of the first officers on the scene. A 20-year veteran of the force, he had a calm, methodical demeanor that had served him well. But the unique horror of a missing child case always tested that composure. He found Sarah and Tom near the first aid tent. Sarah's face a mask of frantic, tear-streaked disbelief. Tom's a picture of grim, helpless fury. Miller's investigation was, by the book, thorough. He sealed the festival grounds, interviewed dozens of people who were near the lemonade stand. The stories were all the same. A lot of noise, a big crowd, no one saw a thing. A few people remembered seeing Leo, a cute kid playing with a toy airplane. But no one saw him leave. No one saw him with a stranger. It was as if the earth had simply opened up and swallowed him. The hours bled into days. The initial search, a massive effort involving hundreds of volunteers combing every inch of Harmony Creek, turned up nothing. Not a shoe, not a dropped toy, not his little red airplane. The river was dragged. The surrounding woods were searched. Nothing. The media descended, their satellite trucks lining the streets. Leo's gap-toothed smile was suddenly on every television screen in the state. The Vance's life became a public spectacle of pain. Miller shielded them as best he could, but the questions were relentless. Had they argued? Were there problems at home? The insinuation, the veiled accusation that they were somehow responsible, was another layer of agony. Miller pursued every lead, no matter how flimsy. He investigated local sex offenders. He looked into a report of a strange van seen near the park, but it turned out to belong to a tourist. He chased down a dozen false sightings in other states. The case file grew thick with dead ends. The prevailing theory, the one Miller secretly held onto, was a stranger abduction. It was the cleanest but also the most terrifying explanation. A predator had seen an opportunity in the chaos of the festival, and in a matter of seconds had seized it. Weeks turned into months. The national media left, moving on to the next tragedy. The yellow ribbons tied around the trees in town grew faded and tattered. The search parties stopped. But for Sarah, Tom, and Detective Miller, the search never ended. It simply became a quieter, more desperate affair. Miller would reread the files late at night in his office, going over the same witness statements again and again, hoping a new detail would emerge, a new connection he had missed. It never did. For Sarah, the world had lost its color. Every waking moment was consumed by the what-ifs. What if she hadn't stopped for lemonade? What if she had held his hand tighter? The guilt was a physical weight, a crushing presence that never left her. She became an expert on child abduction, on forensic science, on everything and anything that might give her a sliver of hope. Now, in 2025, sitting in the park with Jessica Riley, the memory of that day was as vivid as ever. It wasn't a memory. It was a wound that had never closed. She could still smell the popcorn, still hear the band, still feel the crushing, world-ending panic of turning around and finding only empty space where her son should have been. The silence that followed his disappearance had been deafening, a void that had swallowed her life. She had no idea that the woman walking away with her own little boy held the key to finally, mercifully, breaking it. The tentative friendship between Sarah Vance and Jessica Riley grew organically over the next few weeks. They would run into each other at the grocery store or the post office, their initial park bench conversation blossoming into a comfortable familiarity. Jessica found herself drawn to Sarah's quiet strength, while Sarah was warmed by Jessica's genuine kindness. A kindness free from the pity she so often saw in the eyes of people who knew her story. They were from different worlds, their lives shaped by profoundly different circumstances, but at their core, they were both mothers. It was a language they shared. The conversation that would change everything happened, fittingly, on the sidelines of a children's soccer game. It was a chilly Saturday morning in early November. Noah Riley was playing in his first ever league game, and Jessica, bundled in a thick sweater, was cheering him on with the anxious pride of all new sports moms. Sarah had come to the park for her customary weekend walk and, seeing Jessica, had wandered over to say hello. They stood together near the bleachers, clutching steaming cups of coffee, making small talk as the swarm of 7-year-olds chased the ball up and down the field. They talked about the upcoming holidays, the absurd amount of energy young boys possessed, and the surprising camaraderie of sideline parents. "Noah looks so much like his dad," Sarah commented, watching the boy run, his face a picture of fierce concentration. "But he has your eyes." "He's a good mix," Jessica laughed. "All I see is the potential for grass stains and ER visits." Sarah smiled, a genuine, wistful expression. "Enjoy it. It goes by in a blink. I still remember Leo at this age. He was pure energy. Always running, always inventing some grand adventure." It was the first time Sarah had volunteered information about Leo without being prompted. Jessica felt a pang of sadness for her. "He sounds like he was a wonderful little boy," she said softly. "He was," Sarah said, her gaze becoming distant, fixed on a point somewhere in the past. "He had this wild imagination. Everything was a spaceship or a secret agent mission. For weeks before the festival, he was obsessed with airplanes. His grandfather had taken him to an airshow. After that, everything had to fly. His toast would fly into his mouth. His toothbrush would fly to the bathroom." She paused, lost in the memory. "The last thing I ever bought him was a little wooden toy, a bright red airplane. He won it at a game, but I paid for the tickets. He wouldn't put it down. He even slept with it. He called it the Red Comet." Jessica nodded, listening intently, her mind half on the conversation and half on the game. But something about the image Sarah had painted a little boy, completely obsessed with a red toy airplane, pricked at the edges of her memory. It was a faint, fuzzy image, like a half-forgotten dream. She couldn't place it. "He sounds a lot like Noah," Jessica said, shaking off the feeling. "Noah's current obsession is a specific type of Lego dinosaur. If we lose one piece, it's a 4-alarm emergency." Sarah chuckled, the sound a little thin. "I remember those days. Leo had this tiny, unique birthmark on his hand. A perfect little crescent moon, right on the back of his right hand. I used to tell him it was where the moon had kissed him goodnight." She sighed, the happy memory instantly turning painful. "I'm sorry. I don't mean to." "No, please don't apologize," Jessica said quickly. "It's good to talk about him, to remember him." But Jessica's mind was no longer fully there. Sarah's words, "crescent moon on his right hand," had been a lightning strike. The fuzzy image in her head snapped into sharp, sudden focus. The prickle of familiarity became a jolt, a full-body shock that made the coffee in her hands tremble. She wasn't on a soccer field in Ohio in 2025. She was 16 again, back in the summer of 1997. She was in a different state, a different life. She was Jessica Malone, working a grueling summer job as a waitress at a dusty, 24-hour diner called the Silver Star, just outside of Reno, Nevada, trying to save money for a car. The memory was so vivid, so complete, it was breathtaking. It was a Tuesday night, late, during a sweltering heat wave. The diner was mostly empty. A man and a little boy came in and sat in her section in a booth by the window. The man was clean-cut, polite, but had a tense, coiled energy about him. The boy was small, maybe 6 or 7, with sandy brown hair, and he was clutching a small, bright red wooden airplane. Jessica remembered it so clearly because the boy was crying. Not loudly, but silently, with tears streaming down his face. A picture of pure, exhausted misery. The man, who said he was the boy's father, seemed annoyed by it. "He's just tired," the man had said to Jessica, a smile on his face that didn't reach his eyes. "It's been a long drive." Jessica had tried to be nice to the boy. She brought him a complimentary scoop of ice cream. When she set it down, she noticed his hand resting on the table, right next to the red airplane. And on the back of his right hand was a small, dark birthmark. It was shaped like a perfect crescent moon. The detail had stuck with her because it was unusual. She remembered thinking it was a cute, unique mark. The boy didn't touch the ice cream. He just kept crying, his shoulders shaking. The man paid the bill in cash, hurried the boy out of the diner, and they drove off in a nondescript blue sedan. Jessica had felt a deep unease about the encounter. The boy seemed so sad, so scared, and the father's reassurances felt hollow. She had even mentioned it to the diner's cook, a cynical old man named Al, who had just grunted and said, "Kid's probably a spoiled brat. Not our business." She was 16. It was Nevada. The news was full of local stories. A missing boy from a small town in Ohio? It would never have reached her. The memory, unsettling as it was eventually buried under the avalanche of a teenage girl's life school. Boys, saving for that car. It had lain dormant, a forgotten file in the archives of her mind, for 28 years. "Jessica, are you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." Sarah's voice snapped her back to the present. The sounds of the soccer game rushed back in. Jessica was pale, her eyes wide with a dawning, terrifying realization. "Sarah," she began, her voice a choked whisper. "The toy, the red airplane, the birthmark, the crescent moon." Sarah stared at her, confused. "What about them?" "I've seen him," Jessica breathed, the words feeling huge and impossible in her mouth. "Sarah, I think I saw Leo." And there, on the sidelines of a children's soccer game, with the shouts of happy, playing boys in the background, Jessica Riley told Sarah Vance the story of the sad little boy in the Nevada diner. Every detail she recounted: the time of year, the boy's appearance, the red airplane, and the irrefutable, impossible detail of the crescent moon birthmark was like a defibrillator paddle to Sarah's long-dormant hope. For the first time in 28 years, the case of Leo Vance was no longer cold. It was burning hot, a single, forgotten memory, unearthed by the casual, intimate small talk of two mothers, had just provided the first new lead in more than a quarter of a century. The silence was about to be broken by a deafening roar. The minutes after Jessica's revelation were a blur of raw, chaotic emotion. For Sarah, it was a physical shock, a surge of adrenaline so potent it made her feel lightheaded. Hope, an emotion she had long since buried for fear of its cruelty, clawed its way to the surface with a breathtaking, terrifying ferocity. After 28 years of nothing, of silence and dead ends, this story, this memory was a tangible thing, a thread she could grasp in the darkness. It was specific. It was detailed. It was in a different state, which explained why no one in Ohio had ever seen a thing. It made a horrifying kind of sense. For Jessica, the shock was coupled with a wave of guilt. "I should have done something," she repeated, her hands shaking. "I knew something was wrong. I felt it. But I was just a kid. I didn't." "You couldn't have known?" Sarah insisted, her hands gripping Jessica's arm, her knuckles white. "How could you have possibly known?" "But you know now. Jessica, this is everything." They left the soccer field immediately, their minds racing. They went back to Sarah's house, the house that was a shrine to a memory, and sat at the dining room table that served as the headquarters for the Leo Vance Foundation. For the first time, the table was being used for a real, active lead. Their first call was to the Harmony Creek Police Department. The current chief, a man named Henderson who had been a rookie back in 1997, was polite but deeply skeptical. "Mrs. Vance, I understand why this is exciting for you," he said in a placating tone. "But we're talking about a 28-year-old memory from when Mrs. Riley was a teenager. Eyewitness testimony is notoriously unreliable, especially after so much time. It's just not enough to go on." It was a devastating, but not unexpected, blow. To the police, it was a ghost story, too thin and ethereal to warrant the resources needed to investigate a cross-country cold case that was nearly 3 decades old. But Sarah Vance had not spent 28 years fighting for her son's memory to be deterred by official skepticism. If the police wouldn't help, she knew who would. "We need to find Frank Miller," she said to Jessica, her voice filled with a new, steely resolve. Detective Frank Miller, retired for over a decade, was living a quiet life in a small cabin about an hour outside of town. He spent his days fishing and trying, mostly unsuccessfully, to forget the faces of the victims whose cases he could never close. At the top of that list was Leo Vance. The case was his ghost, the great failure of his career. When Sarah called him, he was hesitant. He had made his peace with the past. But as she laid out Jessica's story, the methodical, cautious cop in him began to stir. He remembered every detail of the Vance file. The boy's favorite toy, the unique birthmark. These were not public knowledge, not details that a stranger would just invent. The specificity was what hooked him. "All right, Sarah," he said, his voice a low grumble. "I'll come into town tomorrow. Let me hear it from the woman herself." The next day, Miller sat at Sarah's dining room table, a mountain of a man who looked older and more tired than Sarah remembered. He listened to Jessica's story without interruption, his gaze intense, his old detective's mind dissecting every word, searching for inconsistencies. Jessica, nervous but resolute, recounted the story of the man and the crying boy in the Nevada diner, just as she had to Sarah. When she finished, Miller was silent for a long time. He stared at the age-progressed photo of Leo on the wall. "A blue sedan," he finally said, more to himself than to them. "We had a dozen reports of blue sedans. It was meaningless then." He turned to Jessica. "The man. What did he look like?" "He was normal," Jessica said, closing her eyes, trying to pull the image from her memory. "Maybe in his late 30s. Brown hair, neatly cut. He wore glasses. He looked like a teacher or a salesman. He was polite, but his eyes were cold. He paid in cash." He said they were driving to California to see family. Miller nodded slowly. He knew this was a long shot, a 1 in a million chance. But it was the only shot they had. "I kept my files," he said, a spark of the old fire in his eyes. "The unofficial ones. The things the department archived. Let me go through." He, Sarah, and Jessica became an unlikely team of investigators. Miller provided the experience, Sarah the encyclopedic knowledge of the case, and Jessica the crucial new lens through which to view the old evidence. Their first task was to try and corroborate Jessica's memory. The Silver Star Diner, they learned, had closed down 15 years ago. But Miller, using old public records and a private investigator friend, managed to track down the diner's former owner, living in a retirement community in Florida. The man barely remembered the place, but he did remember one of his old cooks, a man named Al. Miraculously, Al was still alive, living in Reno. Miller called him. Al, now a grizzled man in his late 70s, was suspicious at first. But when Miller mentioned the young waitress, Jessica Malone, Al grunted in recognition. "Yeah, the jumpy one," he said. And when Miller asked if he remembered anything unusual from that summer, a man with a crying kid, Al was silent for a moment. "You know," he said slowly, "I do remember something like that. She told me the guy gave her the creeps. I told her to mind her own business. Never thought of it again. It was a small victory, but it was huge." Jessica's memory wasn't a phantom. Someone else remembered the conversation. It had happened. The next step was trying to identify the man. Miller focused on the salesman angle. In the late 90s, Harmony Creek was on the route for a number of traveling sales professionals. He cross-referenced lists of companies with employees who would have been in the area in late September 1997. It was a painstaking, needle-in-a-haystack process. The breakthrough came from a box of files labeled miscellaneous tips. In the weeks after the disappearance, the police had been inundated with calls. One was from a woman who ran a local motel. She had called to report a guest who had checked out abruptly early on the morning of September 28th, the day after Leo vanished. His name was Robert Coleman, a traveling textbook salesman. The woman had thought it was odd because he had booked for 2 nights but left after one. He drove a blue Ford Taurus. The police at the time had followed up. Coleman's company confirmed his route. He had an alibi for the time of the abduction, claimed he was in his motel room, preparing for a meeting. There was no way to disprove it. It was a dead end. But now Miller looked at it with new eyes. A traveling salesman. A blue sedan. He did some digging into Robert Coleman. His sales route in the fall of 1997 would have taken him directly from Ohio westward, straight through Nevada, on his way to a conference in California. It was a perfect fit. Miller hired his PI friend again, this time to get a photo of Robert Coleman from 1997, a company ID badge. Anything. 2 days later, an email arrived. Attached was a grainy, black and white photo of a smiling, bespectacled man in his late 30s. With trembling hands, Jessica opened the file. She stared at the screen. The smile was different, but the face, the eyes, it was him. That's him, she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. That's the man from the diner. They had a name. They had a face. After 28 years, Leo Vance's ghost had a name attached to it. Not the name of the victim, but the name of the man who had stolen him. The hunt was on. Finding Robert Coleman in 2025 was surprisingly easy. He was not a man in hiding. He was 66 years old, living in a quiet suburban cul-de-sac in Portland, Oregon. He was a retired sales manager, a respected member of his community, known for his prize-winning roses and his quiet, friendly demeanor. He had remarried after his first wife passed away from cancer over a decade ago, and he had a son, a 34-year-old architect named Daniel Coleman. Frank Miller knew they were treading on dangerous ground. Their evidence was circumstantial. A 28-year-old memory, a half-forgotten tip from a motel owner, and a sales route that put a man in the right place at the right time. It wasn't enough to get the police in Portland to act. They needed more. They needed to be absolutely certain. The crucial piece of evidence would be DNA. But to get a DNA comparison, they needed something from Daniel Coleman. Miller knew that approaching him directly could cause Robert to panic, to run, or to destroy any evidence that might remain. They had one chance to get this right. Sarah, her hope now a burning, painful fire, insisted on going to Portland. Jessica, feeling inextricably linked to the case, went with her. Miller flew out with them, the three of them forming a tight, anxious unit. They checked into a hotel and, with the help of Miller's PI, began a quiet, careful surveillance of the Coleman house. Seeing Robert Coleman in person for the first time was a jarring experience for Jessica. He was older, grayer, and heavier, but the set of his jaw, the way he moved it, was undeniably the same man. Watching him water his roses and wave to his neighbors, it was impossible to reconcile this image of benign domesticity with the cold-eyed kidnapper from her memory. Their focus, however, was on his son. They saw him arrive at his father's house for a Sunday dinner. He was a tall, handsome man with sandy brown hair and kind eyes. He had a wife and a young daughter with him. From a distance, Sarah watched the man who could be her son interact with the family he believed was his. The sight was a cocktail of agony and wonder. He was alive. He was right there. She had to physically restrain herself from running across the street. The PI earned his fee the next day. He followed Daniel from his office to a coffee shop. After Daniel left, the PI went in and retrieved the disposable cup he had thrown away. It was a long shot, but it was all they had. The cup was carefully sealed in an evidence bag and sent overnight to a private lab that Miller trusted, along with a sample of Sarah's DNA for a maternity test. Then came the hardest part, the waiting. For 3 days, Sarah, Jessica, and Miller barely slept. They stayed in their hotel rooms, the silence thick with unspoken fears and desperate hopes. What if they were wrong? What if this was all a terrible, tragic coincidence? The call from the lab came on a Wednesday afternoon. Miller put it on speakerphone. "Frank," the lab technician said, "you're not going to believe this." Sarah held her breath, her heart feeling like it was going to stop. "We have a match," the technician continued. "A 99.999% probability. The DNA from the cup belongs to the biological son of the DNA provider, Sarah Vance." A choked sob escaped Sarah's lips. It was a sound of 28 years of pain, grief, and hope released in a single explosive moment. Jessica hugged her, both women crying freely. It was true. It was all true. Leo was alive. His name was Daniel Coleman. Armed with irrefutable proof, Miller went to the Portland police. Faced with the DNA evidence, they could no longer ignore him. A quiet, multi-jurisdictional investigation was launched. They delved into Robert Coleman's past. They discovered that he and his first wife, who had died in 2012, had suffered through years of infertility. They were desperate for a child. And Robert's sales route had put him in Harmony Creek on the exact day a little boy went missing. The motive, the opportunity, it was all there. The arrest was made quietly, without fanfare. 2 detectives knocked on Robert Coleman's door on a Friday morning. He was calm, collected, and denied everything. But when they presented him with the DNA results, the mask shattered. The quiet retiree vanished, and a cold, defeated man took his place. He confessed everything. It was an act of pure, selfish impulse. He had seen Leo at the festival, a perfect, beautiful boy, the son he could never have. In the chaos of the crowd, he had simply offered him a piece of candy, taken his hand, and walked him away. No one noticed. He told Leo they were playing a game, a secret agent mission. He drove all night, feeding the boy a story that his mother and father had sent him on a special trip. By the time the boy was in the diner in Nevada, he was exhausted, terrified, and confused. Robert became his only source of stability. He renamed him Daniel and raised him as his own. His wife, complicit in the crime, helped him create a new life, a new history, for their son. The most difficult part was the notification. 2 detectives, along with a grief counselor, went to Daniel Coleman's architectural firm. The news that the man he knew as his father was a kidnapper, that his entire life was a lie, was a blow that almost broke him. His memories of his early childhood were foggy, dreamlike fragments that Robert had told him were from a different city they had lived in before his mother got sick. The reunion between Sarah and the man now known as Leo/Daniel took place in a quiet room at the Victim Services Center. It was not the joyous, tearful embrace of a movie. It was awkward, painful, and overwhelmingly emotional. He was a stranger. She was a stranger. But as they looked at each other, there was a flicker of recognition in his eyes. He looked at her face, then down at his own right hand, at the crescent moon birthmark that had solved the mystery of his life. "You used to tell me it was a moon kiss," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. Sarah burst into tears. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I did." The aftermath was complex. Robert Coleman was extradited to Ohio and sentenced to life in prison. The town of Harmony Creek celebrated. The ghost that had haunted it for so long finally given a name and a future. For Leo, the journey was just beginning. He had to reconcile 28 years of a life he had loved with the truth of its horrifying origin. He had to get to know his biological mother while navigating the betrayal of the man who had raised him. Months later, back in Harmony Creek, Sarah and Jessica sat on the same park bench where they had first met. Leo, he had decided to go by Leo again, was pushing his own daughter on the swings, his laughter echoing in the autumn air. It was a sound Sarah had thought she would never hear again. "All those years," Sarah said, her eyes fixed on her son, her grandson. "He was out there, living a life. All because you ordered a cup of coffee and felt like talking to a stranger." Jessica smiled, watching Noah play with his new cousin. "It was just small talk," she said softly, but they both knew it wasn't. It was a miracle, born from a mother's memory, that had traveled 28 years and crossed a continent to bring a lost boy home.